In order that all sentient beings may attain Buddhahood, from my heart I take refuge in the three jewels. In order that all sentient beings may attain Buddhahood, from my heart I take. In order that all sentient beings may attain Buddhahood, from my heart I take refuge in the three jewels. Whatever the virtues of the many fields of knowledge, all their steps on the path of omniscience, may these arise in a clear mirror of intellect. O Manjushri, please accomplish this. Hey, good evening, welcome back for this part two, where we dive into the Yogacara tradition and Tathagata Garbha in the synthesis of Madhyamaka and Yogacara. And I sort of feel like, regardless of how poorly I'm able to add any benefit to these texts, I think it's awesome that you guys are going to read these texts. It's like so good that you'll check out these texts and we can look at them together. So I'm really happy about that. At the same time, they're very difficult. Nagarjuna was difficult in his way, and these are difficult also in their ways, particularly the sutras. So tonight we have readings from two source texts, the Samdhi Nirmochana, Unraveling the Intent, and the Lanka Avatar, the entry into Lanka Sutras. And from what I could gather, the Samdhi Nirmochana Sutra appeared first in the historical record, whatever that means. And the Lanka Avatar after, so we'll go through the Samdhi Nirmochana first. And just one comment that I'm reminded of a famous statement, I think by Chandrakirti, that in order to understand the sutras of the Mahayana, one needs to be a eighth Bodhisattva Bhumi or above. So, in other words, these are hard to understand, these sutras, and it's a long process towards understanding them. There's no better thing to do than to begin, or to continue for many of us that have seen them before. Chris, do you want to say anything else before we dive into the source materials? When we'll give little intros to each at that point.
Um, I think it's interesting the context in which these sutras appear. One of the most important things to consider when reading any sutra is where the teaching was given and to whom it was given. And these seem to appear by their own telling um, after the teachings of the Prajnaparamita Sutras. So the Lankavatara Sutra begins with the Buddha having just finished a week of teaching the Nagas and their Naga king, Sagara, in his underwater palace. So there is, in that context, a sense of occurring after a development, as we have the first turning, the teachings on the cessation, on suffering, on cessation, the path, then developing further into the teachings on emptiness and Prajnaparamita. We have a further evolution into Yogacara, the third turning teachings. And this is a little different. I think we're often in the synthesis of Madhyamaka and Yogacara, it's often presented the Madhyamaka is the higher view and Yogacara is somewhat more provisional or an explanation of the relative truth, where a Madhyamaka is concerned with the ultimate truth. In this case, the development seems to go in the other direction, where Madhyamaka comes first and Yogacara, a further perhaps refinement or progression after that. And this is also the case. So in Lankavatara, the Buddha's finished teaching Prajnaparamita, and then has moved on to Lanka, come back to the surface, so to speak, to the island of Sri Lanka, where he'll be teaching the Yakshas, a different class of magical beings, the Nagas being the previous class of magical beings he's taught. Now he's teaching the Yakshas, which are another sort of nature spirit, and in particular, they live in trees, among other places. And their king is said to live on Sri Lanka, and he's sort of a large character in Indian literature. Um, but then in this some help me with the pronunciation here, Samiti Derek. How do we pronounce the other sutra we've read?
Oh, Samdi Nirmochana.
Sadmi Nirmochana. I swear,
Samdi
Near
Nirmochana.
Mochana. Sometimes I don't know if you guys are like this. I like see these Sanskrit words and I just like blank out on them. So this okay, so while Prajnaparamita Sutras takes place at Volta Peak and Lankavatara Sutra takes place in the island of Sri Lanka, this sutra takes place in just sort of like a magical realm, a place that isn't really defined geographically. And that's very interesting as it relates to this idea of mind only, right? So previously there, places in India that you could go to. Now we're in a place of the mind, you know. So this is just in terms of thinking about the setting of these sutras, already you have some sense of what they're about and how to understand them in the context of the philosophical points of view that are presented. So with that, I'll hand it back to Derek.
Cool. Thank you for all that, setting up the situation for the Lankavatara Sutra. So we come back to the Samdi Nirmochana Sutra, which is one of the earlier Yogacara type sutras to appear. And the opening sets us in a sort of cosmic realm, as Chris said. Not related, as Chris described, the Lankavatara is also sort of a cosmic realm, although it is related to the island of Lanka, Sri Lanka, Ceylon, called Ceylon for a little while by certain people for some reason. And said that the Buddha visited there, took a giant stride, one step, and went there to visit those people there and landed on a peak that has become known as Adam's Peak that you can visit to this day. And he wrote his initials on that peak. That was the last part was a joke, by the way, right? Okay, so we're told that the context for this sutra is that there were disciples of the Buddha debating with disciples who were confused about the Dharma, who were asking them questions, and they don't come to any consensus. The doubts are not clarified by the disciples of the Buddha, so they appeal to the Buddha to come in and explain various aspects of the Dharma. And he gratefully appears to do that. And the sort of leading bodhisattvas of that assembly, one by one, ask him questions about certain topics. They have a discourse, not just one question, but a back and forth about certain topics that form the content of each of the chapters of the Samdi Nirmochana Sutra. And the Samdi Nirmochana Sutra is famous for introducing concepts such as the Alaya Vijnana, the three natures, as a sort of alternative to the two truths. And the idea of there being, that the third turning of the wheel of the Dharma surpasses the second turning, as Chris explained, as the progression from Madhyamaka to Yogacara, as it is viewed in the Yogacara tradition. And so we have some of those key chapters to look at for that information, for those discourses. I've also used the 8th chapter of this text extensively in other courses because it's the root presentation of Shamatha Vipassana in the Mahayana tradition, discourse between the Buddha and Maitreya, the future Buddha. And he covers, gives an amazing presentation on Shamatha Vipassana. So here we begin with chapter 4 of this sutra, and I thought I might screen share it a little bit and go through it, focus on some key parts, and skip around a little bit. I'm just setting it up and then I'll do that. This translation, by the way, is the second translation into English of this sutra. The first one was by John Powers, which I've used many times for the 8th chapter before, published rather, back in 94, 95. And this one comes out in 2025 through the 84,000 project of Dzongtsar Khyentse Rinpoche, translating the words of the Buddha, by a translator named Gregory, where's his name? Gregory Fuchs. Oh, we don't have his name here. It was in the syllabus, which you haven't seen yet. Sorry, I'll screen share. So here we have Bodhisattva Vishalamati asked the Blessed One, when bodhisattvas who are skilled in the secret of mind, thought, and cognition are called skilled in those three, what does that mean? When you say that about bodhisattvas, what do you mean? The Buddha regularly answers each query initially with, "This is a great question, thank you for asking on behalf of everybody else." And there's a little bit of an implication that maybe Vishalamati and the others who ask these questions know the answers, but they're sort of setting up the situation for the Buddha in the way that happens in many sutras, including the Heart Sutra, where Shariputra asks Avalokiteshvara about emptiness or Prajnaparamita. And so I will explain to you what that means when such and such beings are reborn and manifest in samsara, in the 6 destinies, meaning the 6 realms that we're all familiar with, be they born in one of the 4 ways of birth, egg, womb, moisture, or spontaneously generated, which is the way deities arise and beings arise in, well, it really refers to the way beings are born into the form and formless realms, just spontaneously appear, as opposed to deities. There's a twofold appropriation, so this twofold process of taking rebirth has these 2 aspects. First, there's the appropriation of the physical sense faculties with their supports, which doesn't necessarily means that there's an objective, independent external world as the supports, but they're just we take on the physicality of a sentient being. And then there's the mental imprints, the appropriation of the mental imprints, the karmic propensities, producing the elaboration of conventional expressions, conceptuality, conceptual framework with regard to phenomenal appearances, names, and conceptualizations. Independence upon this twofold process, the mind containing all the seeds matures. It merges, this translator says it merges with the, I was going to check the other translation. So he says it merges with the embryo, like trying to place it physically in the process of birth, not birth, the part that happens before birth, which you can't remember. But the other translation says, the mind in which all seeds ripens, it increases, it develops and expands in its operations. So it doesn't have this implication of the physicality of an embryo, like a sperm on an embryo. A sperm and an egg forming the embryo. This twofold appropriation occurs in the realm of form, but does not in the formless realm, because you got it, there's no form. The appropriating cognition grasps and appropriates the body, which is a little unclear because it implies that the body is something separate, like separately existing. It's more like it grasps and appropriates the idea of having a body, I think we would have to say. It's also called subliminal cognition, and the other translator has base consciousness, so this translator is using subliminal cognition for Alaya Vijnana, because it dwells and lies hidden in this body, sharing a common destiny. The other translator says, because there is the same establishment and abiding within those bodies, which is also a little bit unclear, this common destiny. Anyway, it's called mind because it is accumulated. The other translator says, because it collects and accumulates form, smells, tastes, and so forth. And this translator says, and it is developed via visual forms, smells, etc. So between the two of them, we have this process of connecting with the predisposition for physicality and the process of karmic propensities from prior lifetimes ripening into that physical manifestation. Cynthia.
So in terms of appropriation, am I understanding that what is doing the appropriation is cognition, and that is appropriating both this so-called physical, as you've described, and also the Alaya Vijnana? So is it sort of three things, three seeming entities, one being this cognition, one being the physical, and one being the repository mental imprints and all that, the Alaya Vijnana? Or is it more that the
It's a great question. And
consciousness is appropriate in the body? Yeah, I mean, I can't tell if there's two or three.
Yeah, and so this goes back to my statement of it's difficult to understand these sutras. They're not 100% clear. And the issue you raise gets into the whole difficulty of the Yogacara project in the light of the Madhyamaka emphasis on not coming up with any structures, with any schemes to explain anything, because they concluded you can't explain anything. as Morgan expressed to us last week. Once you read the first chapter of the Mula Madhyamaka Karak, it's like, how can you, it's sort of like either humorous or cruel or diluted to go on and try to explain these things. But they felt that it was helpful, and we'll see later that they found that people misunderstood the Madhyamaka, the Madhyamaka presentation of emptiness as being a complete voidness or emptiness, or sort of a barren emptiness. So we'll come back to that. But yes, it seems in this clunky way of talking about things, we have a mind, which is the Alaya Vijnana, continuity between lifetimes. And that mind connects with the impregnated embryo, which we don't know yet if that's like a physical or mental phenomena, and that Alaya Vijnana brings with it. So the physicality of the embryo has a karmic momentum of producing sense faculties, all the faculties of the body, whether that's a desire realm body or a form realm body. It would naturally turn into whatever body, of a human, of a dog, of whatever it is. And the Alaya Vijnana connects with that, and the Alaya Vijnana brings with it the karmic propensities of thinking that it exists, and thinking that it exists as X, Y, or Z, and so on and so forth. And so what are those things? Are they things? Is the Alaya Vijnana a thing? Is it produced? All the Madhyamaka analysis you could apply to that and come up with basically just letting go again of all these attempts to explain things. What is the Alaya Vijnana? What is karma? Is karma, how can it, this idea of taking up karma as if it's like one thing swallowing or engulfing, as Trump used to like to say, engulfing another thing. And then they're like, are they one after that? Or are they still two? All of these existential ontological questions are made way more complicated. But it's the idea general, and we'll come in other readings, we'll have very nice presentations of the philosophy by Westerhoff and someone else who's, I can't remember at the moment, but presentations of these ideas, these various ideas, and an attempt to present them from the Yogacara point of view, to the extent that that can be done as valid schemes. So that's the first one we encounter. And the main point of this chapter is that this process has it has some complexity about the number of objects that can arise at the same time, which we can see as like a little throwback to arguments between Vaibhashikas and Sautrantikas of like, can a consciousness have more than one object at one time? If it does, are there multiple consciousnesses that operate at the same time? Things like that, we see. So a presentation of that issue. The key point, though, is taken in this way, the knowledge of this doctrine is support and basis. So bodhisattvas are skilled in these three things. When the Tathagata designates these bodhisattvas as skilled in this way, they are not skilled merely on account of like understanding this scheme in the way it was just explained, but they are skilled in the ultimate. And so here we have this sort of blending back with the Madhyamaka. They don't perceive an appropriation or appropriation cognition, but they perceive in accordance with the truths. They neither perceive the subliminal nor the subliminal cognition, neither the accumulated, nor the mind, nor the form, nor the I, nor any of these things they don't perceive. So we have a little throwback to the Heart Sutra. And that's a true bodhisattva understands both their imaginary, although he hasn't introduced the term imaginary yet, so that I shouldn't really say that. But this one way of understanding this process of taking up birth, and the true way of understanding it is that there really is nothing that happens in ultimate reality. So we get a little presentation of the two truths with the addition of the Alaya Vijnana, basically. The next chapter, Bodhisattva Gunakura.
Ask one
Sure.
question, comment, whatever. Just that last verse in the one we just finished.
The summary.
Where it says profound and subtle is the appropriating cognition. That does seem to suggest that the appropriating cognition is the Alaya Vijnana, containing all the seeds. It flows like a stream of water, and he didn't teach it because people would think it was the self, which is the common statement. They say that people mistake the Alaya Vijnana for the self. So that does suggest that that the cognition and the Alaya Vijnana are kind of being treated as the same.
Thank you so much. Yes, indeed it does. I shouldn't have skipped that last little stanza because it does provide both a summary and a nice additional profundity to the presentation. And it seems clear that the appropriating cognition is also the Alaya Vijnana. It both contains seeds and it flows like a stream of water, meaning those seeds create the current and future experience.
And also, I think it means that it's changing all the time.
Thank you. Yeah, right. Just like they said above, it's constantly changing. It's not the same water. And he says, I don't teach this to the immature. And so there's a little jab to those of the Madhyamaka tradition who are being referred to as being immature in understanding emptiness as a complete vacuity or negative, non-implicative negation. Lest they would, but there's also those who would incorrectly imagine this appropriating cognition, Alaya Vijnana, to be a self. So really the immature applies to people who would misunderstand Alaya Vijnana as being me.
And I think that that applies not only to people who immaturely misunderstand the philosophy, but also speaks to regular ordinary consciousness, that the seventh consciousness, the Alaya Vijnana being the eighth, but the seventh consciousness continuously and repeatedly mistakes the Alaya Vijnana as the self. That's sort of its function.
Yeah, and we know that because we know the whole scheme, but was there an implication of that here?
No, there isn't an implication of that. I was just relating this to the schematic version that comes out later. So thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, which is interesting, So we know this whole scheme, or at least most of us are familiar with the eight consciousness scheme and the Yogacara ideas. And so there's like this historical development of the presentation of these ideas in these different sutras. And so this is, as Chris points out, it's latent in this sutra, but so far it hasn't been explicitly presented. So let's jump back to Gunakura. When you say that bodhisattvas are skilled in defining the characteristics of phenomena, what do you mean? What are you referring to? Again, thank you for asking this question. What are their defining characteristics are three. So here's the famous three natures. And there is a very rather extensive and subtle and somewhat confusing presentation of these three natures that follows. And I'll try to see if I can find the key parts of that. They are the imaginary defining characteristic, the other dependent defining characteristic, and the actual defining characteristic. The imaginary is conceptuality. The other dependent is sort of this idea that there's some foundation of appearance upon which we conceive this and that. So the other dependent nature is the basis upon which the imaginary defining characteristic arises in the minds of sentient beings who are not enlightened. The actual is the ultimate defining characteristic, the true, real defining characteristic of reality. And there's a sort of unclear and complicated reference or referent for these three natures. Are we talking about a specific object has these three natures? Are we talking about the mind has these three natures? Are we talking about all of reality has these three natures? I think it's helpful to remember that we're in the context of the mind-only school, so there are no external phenomena. And so this is basically talking about the mental world of the Yogacara realm. The imaginary defining characteristic is nominally and conventionally posited as the essence of the distinctive characteristic of phenomena, just to designate them. So, as the essence or distinctive character of phenomena, this is not like a fourth characteristic, but this is that when we talk about fire as hot and burning, water as wet and moist, we're talking about the distinctive characteristics of phenomena, and that is the conventional. So the characteristics are conventionals in order to designate them. So we designate them, we discriminate objects based on their characteristics, their colors, their shapes, their qualities, and their function.
Derek, do you see this similar as to how the dharmas were designated by the Abhidharmakas?
Well, I think it turns out to be the way that agglomerations or conglomerations of dharmas are discriminated in the Abhidharma, as opposed to the underlying partless particles, the real dharmas. I think there's a subtle reference to the imaginary as being colors and shapes and types, and that the dependent is more like a reference to the underlying dharmas. And going back to the Abhidharma, we don't perceive the underlying dharmas, we only perceive their agglomerations, which are not actually held to be real in the Abhidharma in this strange way. And in the Abhidharma, I think it's a confusing thing, because we do say, well, we see color and shape, but dharmas don't have color and shape, So it's I think it's trying to sort of separate or clarify that confusion in the Abhidharma. There's visual, a dharma has these 8 aspects. So there's a visual dharma, auditory, and so forth, that come together to make a particle. And those partless particles that don't touch or join in any way create conglomerated dharmas that we can experience and see and touch and so forth and eat. But they say that the genuine is the actual dharmas, and whatever falls apart when you analyze it is the ingenuine or not genuine. So I think that's an interesting reference. Thank you for bringing that up, back to the Abhidharma. I think in some way it's a way of sort of clarifying that distinction that comes up in the Abhidharma, and it's not really fully resolved. Do you have any further?
I just think that the relationship between Abhidharma and Yogacara is very nuanced and interesting. With Abhidharma and Madhyamaka, it seems relatively straightforward. Um, the Madhyamaka project is sort of a further continuation of the Abhidharma project and kind of blows it up using its own tools. Whereas Yogacara relates in it, they often seem like they're totally separate things, but of course, everything that happens historically is dialectical, and they were relating with the Abhidharma traditions that came before them. And it's a much more subtle influence that that tradition has within Yogacara. So that's kind of why I was asking that question, because I'm sort of curious about this relationship myself.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And interestingly, many of the Yogacara treatises, particularly of Sangha and some of Maitreya, are considered to be Abhidharma. They're not like viewed as they wouldn't be called Madhyamaka, but they didn't say like, well, there's view, and Madhyamaka and Yogacara are two types of view. They basically called themselves Abhidharma. So the distinction between the middle and extremes by Maitreya, one of his 5 texts, is called the Yogacara Abhidharma text, interestingly.
Right, and it posits a whole Abhidharma system, which is unique from the ones that came before in terms of number of dharmas and so forth.
Right, right. But it's much more an extension of that system
Mhm.
by like expanding the dharmas, adding 2 more consciousnesses, trying to explain karma, than it is a Madhyamaka type system, which is just like. On the other hand, it tries to weave the two together and present these 3 natures, which is an extrapolation of the 2 truths, and it's sort of like how do the 2 truths matrix onto the dharmas, and this idea of true dharmas and not true dharmas. But that's a very important angle to think about as we go through these texts. We'll see this a lot, particularly in Vasubandhu's texts, where he basically like goes through the mental factors.
I think one of the questions, and this relates to what Morgan was talking about last week, after the question of after the Mula Banyamaka Karakas, what, if anything, can be posited? Um, and the Yogacara tradition, thinks, well, quite a lot, actually. And as we read through these important texts of that tradition, I think one of the questions we should ask ourselves is, are we convinced that we agree that these sorts of things can be posited?
Right. And so from the Madhyamaka tradition point of view, the answer flatly is a very simple no. And they say the Yogacara tradition and the third trend, they just miss the boat. And they're basically for people who can't understand the profundity of actual emptiness. And the Yogacara tradition says that on the one hand, there are people that understand emptiness in a negativistic way who have missed the boat. And on the other hand, there are people that understand the Madhyamaka intellectually, but it has not produced the transformation internally that it was meant to produce. And so clearly there's something more that's needed to bring about a genuine experience of the understanding of Nagarjuna's profundity. Morgan.
Sorry, I was just saying, yes, I totally get the understand it intellectually, don't actually experience it.
I see you were saying you were one of those,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
like me. I am too. Cynthia.
Yeah, I feel like there's sort of a middle ground of we might not fully buy the this is a real thing, really there's an olive genre or whatever. But I mean I find this stuff very helpful in terms of just trying to, it sort of adds a little bit to the understanding of how things might happen, how things, well, whether it's completely true or not, but I feel like that's where the sort of practitioners, it's helpful, I think, for your practice, whether or not it's absolutely true. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely.
And I
Definitely.
think there's a huge emphasis on practice that exists in the Yogacara tradition that isn't explicitly emphasized to the same extent. Correct me if you think I'm wrong, Derek. In the Madhyamaka tradition, and the name itself, Yogacara, refers to yoga. The practice and the sense that the people who held this tradition were very uh, seasoned practitioners. I think part of the question that
Okay.
comes out of Madhyamaka is, oh, okay, so nothing exists, but then what happens when a Buddha enters samadhi? What are they experiencing? And can words be put to that?
Okay. Let's keep going. Here we have, we did the imaginary nature, defining characteristic, the imaginary defining characteristic. So the term characteristic is often translated as nature. So 3 natures, 3 characteristics. And second one, what is the other dependent defining characteristic of phenomena? It is the dependent arising of phenomena. That phenomena arise interdependently and not independently. When this is, that arises. Because this arises, that arises. It's also from independence upon ignorance as a condition. Conditioning factor, mental factors arise up to thus the whole great mass of suffering comes to be. And so he's quoting himself. The Buddha is quoting himself from an earlier sutra where he explains in Pratitya Samutpada. Let's see what the other translation says. Yeah, because this arises, that arises. This one is easily misunderstood as the first one producing the second one, but it's clarified in that sutra where the Buddha teaches us that this doesn't actually produce that, but it's one of a number of necessary causes for the arising of that. It's not sufficient. There's a nuance in the understanding of Buddhism. There's this idea of necessary but not, but versus sufficient. Sufficient would mean if these guys are there, then it'll happen. Necessary means it's one of a group of things that is required for this to happen, but it's not the only one. Or it's not the only ones. Anyway, that's the dependent nature. So laying the groundwork in an introductory way, because these are not immediately clear. We'll see how he clarifies them. What is the actual defining characteristic of phenomena? Is their true reality, namely unsurpassable, complete, and perfect awakening that is finally attained by bodhisattvas as they realize this true reality through their diligence and correct application of mind, and then become perfectly familiar with the realization of this true reality. So, in some ways, the first and the third are easiest to understand. The first is just the realm of conceptuality where we all live, of things as being big and small and this and that and so forth, good and bad and red and blue and so forth. And the third one is ultimate emptiness, ultimate nature of true nature of reality. And the middle one is the confusing one. And the middle one is where the confusion in this tradition really manifests and is an issue of great debate later on. he gives an example. The imaginary is, and so I got to speed up here because we're not going to get time for Chris to go through Lankavatara.
It's fine with me.
Lankavatara is like even more difficult than this one in terms of being chaotic and so forth. Let's see. How about this one? You should consider the mental imprint of conventions in terms of imaginary defining characteristic upon the other dependent defining characteristic. So we imprint conventions which are called imaginary defining characteristics. We imprint them upon the other dependent nature. This term defining characteristic is translated as one word, and usually nature, upon the other dependent nature. So the way that it's broken into two words, I think, is maybe a little confusing. But just know that it's like supposed to be one thing. The imaginary defining. There's three defining characteristics. There's three natures, right? One's imaginary, one's other dependent. So we imprint our imaginary ideas upon the other dependent, like the contact of colors with a pure crystal. This is a very common analogy. So on the basis of a crystal that is imprinted with different colors by being near different colors. Sorry, I should have started here. When the pure crystal is in contact with something blue, it appears to be blue. And people perceive it by mistake as blue or sapphire. When it's in contact with red, green, etc., we think, oh, it's a ruby, an emerald, or gold. Because people perceive it by mistake as that they are deceived by it. Now, to really drill into this, it's a little unclear whether the colors are imaginary and the ideas of them as being precious stones or crystals is, whether the colors are imaginary or the dependent nature. It's clear that the sapphire and so forth is the imaginary nature. We imagine that, for some reason, like something shiny that has this color of gold, we say, oh, that's worth, what is it, $5,000 an ounce now. And something that looks like this is a sapphire. We give it all these lofty names and think that it's the greatest thing in the world. It's just like a crystal that's colored. But in that, so clearly the sapphire part is the imaginary. It's unclear whether the blue and red are dependent or imaginary. Let's see if they further clarify this. You should consider the other dependent nature to be just like the pure crystal. You should consider the actual or true nature, the completely perfected nature, as the permanent and immutable lack of any ontological nature or essence in the defining characteristic, superimposed on the other defining characteristic. So this is the key way that the three natures are presented in the Yogacara tradition, is that the completely perfected nature, here called the actual defining characteristic, the third of the three natures, is the realization that the projected conceptual ideas about things that we project onto the dependent are imaginary. There is permanently and immutably no actuality or essence or true nature in the nature of a sapphire. They have no actual nature. They're empty. They're completely empty. So it leaves open the issue of what is the nature of the other dependent? The second quality, the second of the three natures, the second of the three so-called defining characteristics. And I was having a hard time with trying to transition onto screen, and I didn't highlight this text. But there's a place. Okay, so that's the end. Okay, so at the end, Gunakura, since bodhisattvas distinctly perceive in this way these three, the imaginary, other dependent, and the true or actual natures or defining characteristics of phenomena. And this statement of phenomena, remember, is not that, I'm going to say, accurate or helpful, because it implies that there's phenomena and they have natures. And it's more like there's imaginary phenomena, there's other dependent phenomena, and there's that there's one world called mind only, and in that mind only there arise imaginary conceptuality, and there's something that conceptuality was related to, which is the dependent, based on perceiving appearances. And so then we ask, where did those appearances come from? And they don't answer that question. But Buddhism is not about origins. And we hearken back to the Buddha saying, I'm not going to answer the question on where everything came from, which is one of the 14 questions, basically. It doesn't matter. It's not helpful. It would lead into misunderstanding and unhelpful conceptuality. There are appearances, and we believe that there are appearances, and those appearances become conceptualized as this and that, and when we uproot the conceptualization, we realize that appearances are the true nature, which is emptiness. The afflictions are based on the belief in the imaginary characteristics. This part here, they deceive these three natures exactly as they are. They distinctly perceive the phenomena devoid of a defining characteristic, which is the ultimate, those characterized by affliction, which is the imaginary, and those characterized by purification exactly as they are. And so we see that there's this subtle implication that the dependent nature has two qualities. It can go both ways. It can go the way of affliction, but when purified of imagination, when purified of conceptuality or misconception, it is the basis of purification. It is purified of conceptuality, and it becomes pure. And this is what later traditions fixate on, is that there's this subtle reification of the dependent nature as having some sort of truly perfected aspect. And so we see in the next chapter a little bit more about that. Here's the summary. Once the phenomena devoid of defined characteristics have been distinctly perceived, phenomena devoid of these three natures, meaning the true nature, the phenomena characterized by affliction due to imagination will be abandoned. Once the phenomena characterized by affliction have been abandoned, the phenomena characterized by purification of that affliction will be obtained.
Though again, here they call it phenomena, which is interesting.
Exactly. So are they talking about the dependent nature is purified, or so? What? They're not precise enough in the presentation of the scheme in this sutra in terms of what later points of view say about it. Chapter 7, just try to touch on this real quickly. Padma Arta Samudgata, Parama Arta Samudgata. He like goes through all the categories. Like the Blessed One talked about all these things. You know, he's talking about the first turning. He talked about all these things as if they're real. And however, then you said all phenomena are without essence unborn. So that's the second turning. What was your underlying intent of the Blessed One? I don't like that he translates this. He says, what was the Blessed One thinking when he said that? Because traditionally the Buddha doesn't have thoughts, right? So it doesn't matter. All phenomena are without essence, unborn, unceasing, primordially in a state of peace, and naturally in a state of nirvana. And these are these qualities that Nagarjuna specifies as well very clearly. And the Buddha, in his one and only description of what his enlightenment experience is, he says this, basically. The Blessed One says, yes, great question, thank you for asking it. The essencelessness of all phenomena has three things. Essencelessness regarding defining characteristics. And this is not, so this is like the same term as was translated as nature, regarding nature, which is the more common translation. Essencelessness regarding arising, which is like function. So nature, function, and then essencelessness regarding the ultimate nature, function, and reality. This is the essencelessness of all phenomena. He goes through it in detail, what these different ones are. And the key is, this is where I got to find the part of it. Let's see. There's an affiliation of different aspects, like of the three doors of liberation, with these three qualities of nature, arising, and true nature. Not nature, characteristic, quality, function, and true nature. Those three aspects of reality. And he's talking about the essencelessness of characteristic or quality, the essencelessness of function, of arising, and the essencelessness of emptiness. So not taking emptiness as something.
And then he gives the three metaphors of the sky flower, the magic illusion, and space.
That's right. That was nice. That relate to those three aspects. God, there was somewhere. So, there's a couple of other things that come up in this. One is that he talks about other vehicles, other students of the Buddha, the Shravakas. So he says, although such beings, where are we? Among those beings, basically he starts talking about how some people wrongly understand what the Buddha says, and those are like, they're off the track. But then there's others that understand but not fully, and those are Shravakas. They understand that conditioned phenomena are impermanent, unstable in relation, and unreliable. They develop aversion and revulsion. They stay away from wrongdoing. They produce the roots of virtue. They clear their obstructions and mental continuums. Their confidence in my teaching becomes vast, and they will accomplish the merit of meriting gnosis. wisdom and merit, but they do not understand essencelessness with regard to arising just as it is, as the essencelessness with regard to characteristics or quality, and essencelessness with regard to the true nature in its two aspects. For this reason, they will not be completely repulsed by all conditions. They will not fully understand what I'm talking about. So he's talking about the Shravakas as being partial understanders. Parma Arta, somewhat Gata, even those belonging to the lineage of hearers, vehicles, attain nirvana, unsurpassable happiness. And as do those belonging to the lineage of the solitary realizers and lineage of the Tathagatas, the Bodhisattvas. So the Pratyeka Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, i.e. Buddhas, the three lineages, the three vehicles. This is why it is the single path. So this idea that there's basically one path for all of them. There's only a single purification. There's no other. This in mind, I taught the single vehicle. And this becomes a major theme in another famous sutra called the Lotus Sutra. He talks a bit more about this idea of different types of yanas, as we call them, Shravaka yana and so forth. And then there's this famous section here. The Bodhisattva says the speech of the Buddha is subtle, profound, difficult to understand. This is how I understand it. There's these three natures. He tries to restate it. This is how I understand it. He basically repeats everything back to the Buddha. And sorry, this is the part I'm trying to get to. The Buddha says, excellent, you got it. And then the Bodhisattva says to the Buddha, okay, I've got it now. This helps me understand that you have three phases of teaching. In the Deer Park, Sarnath, of Rishi Vadana, in Varanasi, the Blessed One first set in motion the wonderful wheel of Dharma by teaching the Four Noble Truths to those who are engaged in the hearer's vehicle, Shravakas. Not a single god or human in the world had previously ever turned such a wheel of Dharma. However, this turning the wheel of Dharma was surpassable and adapted to circumstance, being of provisional meaning. It became a topic of dispute. For those who are engaged in the great vehicle, you turn the second wheel of Dharma in the form of a teaching on emptiness, all phenomena without essence, unborn, unceasing, primordial, in the state of peace, naturally in the state of nirvana. This turning the Dharma wheel by the Blessed One was surpassable and adapted to circumstances. Provisional meaning. It became a topic of dispute. For those who engage in all vehicles, you turn the third wonderful wheel of excellent discernment in reference to the statement, all phenomena without an essence, unborn, etc. This turning of the Dharma wheel by the Blessed One was unsurpassable and not limited to circumstance, being of definitive meaning. It did not become a topic of dispute. So these three topics in this chapter, the three natures, the nuance in the way that the middle nature of dependent arising is understood is very important. Whether it has some nature, some aspect of the dependent that becomes the true, completely perfected nature, or the actual, as it's called here, nature, or whether that dependent nature is like using the two truths scheme, whether it's relative. And this part of the Yogacara sort of presents it that the dependent nature spans the relative and the ultimate. And that becomes a problem for them later on. And then this idea of the three turnings of the wheel of the Dharma. So Sorry, Chris. Why don't you dive into the Blanca Avatar for the remaining time?
Thanks, Derek. Um, so my wife asked me last night if I was ready to teach class tomorrow, and I kind of laughed at her. Like, how could one possibly be ready to present on this material? There's so much of it. It is so difficult to understand. And in particular, when teaching the sutras, I just feel like like woefully unqualified. Um, so I see myself really more as like a cheerleader in this case than someone who really has any idea what he's talking about. So thank you all for bearing with me. Fortunately, Derek's giving me very little time, so I won't have like too many opportunities to embarrass myself. Um, I thought I'd begin by reading a little bit from Red Pine, whose translation we read, his introduction to the text, which we didn't give you, but it's sort of a nice summary. Well, before I do that, let me talk a little bit more about the context of this, historical context of this teaching, um, which I found interesting. Um, so the earliest records we have of it existing in India come from around the year 350 of the Common Era. And it may be that earlier versions of it were circulating prior to that. And there's some scholarship that suggests it was available by the around the time of Nagarjuna. And actually, certain texts, one text ascribed to Nagarjuna seems to pull sort of verbatim from the Lankavatara Sutra. Um, but whether or not it was historically there at that time, the Lankavatara Sutra does present itself as predating Nagarjuna insofar as it contains a prophecy of Nagarjuna being born later. And we actually saw this in some of Nagarjuna's commentators. For this is how they establish his credibility as a commentator, that he was foretold in the Lankavatara Sutra, which is sort of very funny from a Madhyamaka point of view, that, surely they can't accept 95% of what the sutra says, but this little part that prophesizes Nagarjuna is taken to be authoritative. So anyway, I just sort of thought that was funny.
And
So
it appears
yeah,
later than the Garjana.
the sutra itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, based on the records we have, as I said, there is at least one scholar seems to think it was around when Nagarjuna was. Um, but in any event, there was a substantial amount of Madhyamaka and Yogacara developing alongside each other and debating with one another. Okay, so I'm just going to read from his introduction. Just as the Diamond Sutra teaches detachment from dharmas, and the Heart Sutra teaches the emptiness of dharmas, the Lankavatara teaches the non-projection of dharmas, that there would be no dharmas to be empty or to be detached from if we did not project them as existing or not existing in the first place. The Buddha tells Mahamati, because the various projections of people's mind appear before them as objects, they become attached to the existence of their projections. End quote. So how do we get free of such attachments? The Buddha continues, quote, by becoming aware that projections are nothing but mind. Thus do they transform their body and mind and finally see all the stages and realms of self-awareness of the Tathagatas and transcend views and projections regarding the five dharmas and modes of reality. And that's from this text, the Lankavatara Sutra. Having proclaimed the illusory nature of projections, including such yogacara categories as the five dharmas and the three modes of reality, the Buddha directs Mahamati to its source, namely consciousness itself. He then explains how consciousness works and how liberation consists in realizing that consciousness is a self-fabricated fiction, just another illusion, and how bodhisattvas transform their consciousness into the projectionless Tathagata Garbha, or womb from which Buddhas arise. Such a teaching is not something everyone is prepared to hear. But Mahamati continues to ask questions and the Buddha continues to answer, yet in a way that always leads his disciples back to the two teachings that underlie the sutra, the nothing but mind of Yogacara and the self-realization of Zen. It should be noted that Red Pine is a Zenny, so he comes from that angle. Yeah, I'll leave it at that from the introduction. Sort of a nice summary of this text. And I think since our time is very limited, we'll just do one chapter. Well, let me just, I did my best to kind of like write down all of the different themes that came up in the readings that we did, and I'll just run through those. I mean, the interesting thing about Lankavatara Sutra is just how much material it covers, how many different philosophical concepts it lays out without necessarily creating some sort of schema in which these all fit together. Which is, of course, the project of the later Yogacara commentators. Okay, so some themes that came up are the mind only, differences in the Bodhisattva versus Sravaka path, the three natures, Buddha nature, the eight consciousnesses and Alaya Vijnana, the five dharmas, twofold emptiness, and Bodhisattva activity. So quite a lot of material, much more than I could hopefully comment on here. So let me see if this is the right. Let's see. Is that, yeah, okay. So I wanted to read chapter 23, or those are supposed to be eyes. This is supposed to be chapter 23. Pardon the technical difficulties. So I am going to read from this, and I'm just pulling up the footnotes here. Okay. 23. Moreover, Mahamati, bodhisattvas should be well acquainted with the three modes of reality. So this is, of course, the scheme that we just saw with Derek. And I think part of what we're going to be doing in this class is we're just going to be like reading these different definitions of these terms sort of over and over and over again as we go through these readings. So hopefully we'll be really versed in them by the end of it. Bodhisattvas should be acquainted with the three modes of reality. And then this is his footnote, which I thought was very good. The three modes of reality, Triswabhava, include the imagined reality, the dependent reality, and perfected reality. The three modes do not refer to separate realities. They simply represent the three ways we perceive what is real. In imagined reality, we mistakenly perceive things as separate from other things. In dependent reality, we correctly perceive things as dependent on other things, but we still perceive the world in terms of things, which are themselves fictions. In perfected reality, we neither perceive nor do not perceive things, for things neither exist nor do not exist. In perfected reality, we dwell in the realm of the Tathagata Garbha. And then returning back to the sutra. And what are the three modes of reality? Imagined reality, dependent reality, and perfected reality. Mahamati, imagined reality arises from appearances. And how does imagined reality arise from appearances? Mahamati, as the objects and forms of dependent reality appear, attachment results in two kinds of imagined reality. These are what the Tathagatas, the Arhats, the fully enlightened ones describe as attachment to appearance and attachment to name. Attachment to appearance involves attachment to external and internal entities, while attachment to name involves attachment to the individual and shared characteristics of these external and internal realities. So this appears to relate with attachment to conceptuality, then that which is attachment to name, individual and shared characteristics, the conceptual overlay that we place on top of phenomena as it appears, and then attachment to appearance itself. These are the two kinds of imagined reality. What serves as the ground and objective support? And then this is the footnote, 253. The ground of dependent reality is the eighth, or repository consciousness, which supplies the names. The objective support includes the remaining 7 forms of consciousness, including the 5 sensory-based forms of consciousness, which supply the appearance. The Sanskrit for ground is ashraya, and for objective support is alambana. So again, this is kind of going back to the question Derek asked me earlier. This is something of an overlay of the later Yogacara tradition onto this text. I think he is presenting this as much more schematic than what is being presented here, but is nevertheless helpful for understanding it. And then going back to the text right here. And what is perfected reality? This is the mode that is free from name or appearance or from projection. It is attained by Buddha knowledge and is the realm where the personal realization of Buddha knowledge takes place. This is the perfected reality and the heart of the Tathagata. And this footnote I really love. The Tathagata, or womb of the Buddhas, is the name applied to the repository consciousness when it is transformed. So the idea is that the Alaya Vijnana becomes transformed into Tathagata through the path. The Buddha then repeated the meaning of this in verse. Name and appearance and projection. These characterize 2 modes of reality. Correct knowledge and suchness. These characterize the perfected mode. And then he wraps it up by saying, Mahamati, this is what is known as the teaching of how to view what characterizes the 5 dharmas and modes of reality. This is the realm where the personal realization of Buddha knowledge takes place, and which you and other bodhisattvas should cultivate. So that is chapter 23 on the 3 natures. Yeah, Rob.
So I'm a little confused. Tathagata is not produced, right? So how can it be transformed? How can something be transformed into Tathagata?
So I think that there are at least 2 ways of understanding Tathagata. And I think those 2 ways are what distinguish Yogacara from sort of the later understanding of Tathagata that we have inherited, and that come through more clearly in the Tathagata Sutras that we'll be looking at the end of the class. And in the Yogacara understanding, Tathagata is thought of as like a potential that is cultivated and a process that unfolds through purification. This idea of Buddha nature as this little seed that you water and eventually turn into a Buddha. Whereas in the later tradition, the idea is that the Buddha is fully there already and, simply needs to be realized. And those are 2 different sorts of understandings of Tathagata.
So the earlier version
I'm sorry.
that's presented in this sutra is dualistic in that it presents the 8th consciousness as like turning into the Buddha nature. But there's also hints in the sutra, because as Chris explained, this sutra presents lots of different topics in different ways. And there are hints in other parts of the sutra of there being like 2 aspects to the Alaya Vijnana, a pure aspect and an impure aspect. And so this transformation can be interpreted as either A turns into B, which is the sort of dualistic version, or clunky version, or the belief in A dissolves and reveals the reality of B, without B actually changing, or without anything turning into something else. And that's alluded to in various places with this idea of it being already, with it being unchanging and permanent, which we'll see later on. There's this famous phrase that will come up that it's good to remember: as it was before, so it is now.
Yeah, Cynthia.
Just regarding all of that, the view that the Buddha nature is just obscured and has to have the sort of veils removed, does that fall into in terms of what you were just describing, where does that fall into more the second one?
I
Or is that
think
a
I
different view
think so.
altogether?
It has to do with whether you think Buddha nature is something that needs to be developed or whether it's fully developed already. And the
Right.
fully
So,
developed already is the third one.
right. So, I mean, basically, like they referenced in the other reading that was talking about purification. And so, whether it's just the purification of the mind uh, and how it sees it, um, or whether it's, the idea of what is it, adventitious obscurations and all that stuff that
Hmm.
have to be removed.
Hmm.
It, it sort of refers also, like a sort of, to go further with what Chris said, it also includes how you view the obscurations. Are they real or not? But the neat thing about this sutra is this idea of that the eighth conscious, that there's a revulsion or a turning about, transformation that occurs in the eighth consciousness, which is sort of described as, in a samsaric being, the Alaya Vijnana projects outward up into the seventh consciousness, and the seventh consciousness views that it exists, and that gives rise to the others. And then when you sort of dispel the myth of the seventh consciousness, the eighth consciousness sort of like goes through some chemical transformation, alchemy, and turns into what it really is. But I think that's like such an important, experientially helpful analogy of like our our wisdom mind is there. It's just like confused and pointing in the wrong direction. We just need to like let go of the belief in the projection of that, of appearances, and and it also leads to like all the practices of Mahamudra, like turning the light around, turning awareness in on itself, looking at the eighth consciousness.
Rob.
So, it talked about attachments, and I when I was looking at that, I was thinking, well, why that word? Why not just reification? Because it's not always attachment that makes something real for me. Oftentimes, it's aversion. Um, in fact, sometimes even more, it's aversion makes it more real. Like this cold is like too real right now. I'm wearing sweaters in my house. So, like, I think in the realm of the mind, the where I make my mistake is I reify something, and it's not necessarily because I'm attached to it.
The, the underlying cause of all of it is a fixation on existence. So attachment in the way you're revealing is a vague term because it implies one of the three poisons. We now, instead of passion, aggression, ignorance, we now say attachment, aversion, and stupidity. But really what attachment is, it's fixation on sense of something being there. That gives rise to then the three roots, and that gives rise to klesha and karma and so forth.
And since we're just about out of time, I did want to end with one other very brief, I'm not going to show it on my screen, exchange that I found provocative and juicy, which is from the last chapter we looked at, 27. Mahamati again asked the Buddha, "May the Bhagavan please explain to us how all things are empty, non-arising, non-dual, and devoid of self-existence, so that once I and the other bodhisattvas understand that they are empty, non-arising, non-dual, and devoid of self-existence, we will be free of projections of existence and non-existence, and we will quickly realize the unexcelled complete enlightenment?" The Buddha told Mahamati, "Listen closely and consider this well. I will now explain this to you." Mahamati answered, "Wonderful Bhagavan, may we be so instructed." The Buddha began. This is the juicy part. "As for emptiness, Mahamati, emptiness belongs to the imagined reality. Mahamati, it is to those who are attached to an imagined reality that I speak of emptiness, non-arising, non-duality, and the absence of self-existence." So I just thought that was very provocative retort to Madhyamaka chauvinism.
What was the source there, the location for that?
That's right at the beginning of chapter 27, which
Okay.
is the last chapter we looked at.
Right, okay.
And then it goes into 7 types of emptiness.
Right. Yeah, no, I remember that part. I just couldn't remember where it was. Thank you.
And we actually, I mean, we did see a similar version of this in certain Madhyamaka arguments of emptiness being the nature of phenomena, and that being a relative quality. As long as relative phenomena are seen to exist, their relative nature is emptiness, but that ultimately nothing is empty nor non-empty. But as long as qualities are ascribed, they should be ascribed as empty qualities. Anyhow, shall we close out with our chants?
That was a really profound point that you just mentioned. Thank you for that. So that in the relative, we say phenomena are empty, and in the ultimate, we can't talk about phenomena nor emptiness. And that is not the usual understanding of the two truths and emptiness, and that is very much the sort of profound ultimate intent of Nagarjuna. That gets, in the opinion of like the Yogacarans and so forth, that gets lost a lot in other versions of Madhyamaka, actually, and that becomes like a key aspect of the debate. So we'll return, the controversy or differences between the traditions. So we'll return to that. But that was awesome, Chris. Thank you so much. That was so helpful and concise and clear. And I love that the passage you chose, favorite passage. Any final comments before we close? Okay. Back to the cold. Let's dedicate. Chris, you want to lead the dedication? I'll screen share.
By this merit, may all attain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great east, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
I also love the story you tell about your wife asking you if you're ready, because that has happened to me with Jane a number of times, where she'll say, and I have the same response. I'm like, no, you're never ready for this material. It's just like, do your best.
Yeah. Oh,
Thank
she
you,
always tells me,
everyone.
she's like,
Great to
she always tells me, you don't need to be the expert. You're just the guy in the front of the room whose job it is to talk about this stuff.
good for
How
her.
about
That's exactly right. That's
you
great.
could just you could just throw a dart and anywhere in there, and it's profound.
Profound. Yeah, yeah, it is amazing stuff, these sutras. They're so
Mhm.
vast. It's just mind-boggling. Flower ornament sutras, just 1,000 pages of this. It's unbelievable. Anyway, thanks again to Chris and to all of you, and see you soon.
And
Be
thank you,
well.
Derek.
Thank
And yeah,
you.
next week we return to our friend Jan Westerhoff, who's going to give a fairly schematic and sort of like Western analytically oriented overview of this whole tradition that will hopefully be very helpful in terms of unpacking these more dense poetic texts that we'll be spending the remainder of this course looking at.
And on that note, we
Thank you.
finally finished the syllabus, agreed upon the syllabus. And after we agreed upon it, we realized there were like 4 classes that had way too much reading, and we trimmed those down. And so now I have to just compile the source book and link to pagination, and we'll circulate that. But next week is easy. It's in the book that hopefully we all have access to. And if you don't, and you join us for the first time and don't want to spring for that book, let me know and I'll share that chapter with you.
And by the way, your
Thanks
message
again.
did arrive at about 4 minutes before 8 o'clock.
Better late than never, right?
Figure.
Yeah.
Just a funny
But see,
story
it was a,
about us, Derek and I both cutting down the reading together. We sort of miscommunicated about who was doing which class. Both of us did the same class and came up with completely different options. So make of that what you will.
Did you have a good arm wrestling contest to sort it all out?
No, I've adopted the a strategy. Another thing I've learned from my wife. I've adopted the strategy of at moments of disagreement, immediately surrender.
immediately capitulate. And sometimes that produces in the other person of like, wait, no, no, no. But I don't know. I can give the Chris's as optional, and those of you who want to read more can check that out. It was a hard one because well, we'll go into it when we get there. Okay.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Have a
Thank
good night.
you.